Christopher Nolan could have adapted almost any story ever written. Shakespeare? King Arthur? Robin Hood? Beowulf? Instead, he chose the Odyssey, a poem that's nearly 3,000 years old. And Nolan isn't unusual. James Joyce built Ulysses around it. The Coen brothers transformed it into O Brother, Where Art Thou? Madeline Miller reimagined its characters. Universities still teach it. Publishers, still commission new translations. People are still arguing about it. 3,000 years later, which raises an obvious question. Why? What makes this one poem so difficult to leave behind? Because here's the strange thing. The Odyssey wasn't the only Greek epic. In fact, it had competitors. Ancient writers describe an entire collection of epic poems known today as the epic cycle. There were stories about the beginning of the Trojan War, stories about Achilles, stories about Ajax, stories about the wooden horse, stories about what happened after Troy fell. And most of those poems are gone. Some survive only as a few quotations. Others disappeared so completely that we know they existed only because someone else mentioned them. Imagine if, 1,000 years from now, The Lord of the Rings vanished, but people only knew it once existed because another author briefly referenced it. That's what happened to much of ancient Greek literature. So, why not the Odyssey? Why this poem? The obvious answer is because it was simply the best. That sounds reasonable. Until you look closer. History is full of brilliant books that disappeared forever. Being great isn't enough. Something else must have happened. So let's start at the beginning. Imagine you're an author. You finish writing a novel. Now imagine every printed copy disappears. Every computer is destroyed, every hard drive erased. No libraries, no internet, no backups. Would your book survive? Probably not, because books survive by being copied. No copies? No book. Now imagine something even harder. Imagine trying to preserve a 12,000 line poem without writing it down at all. That sounds impossible, but that's remarkably close to the world where the Odyssey began. When the poem first circulated, Greece was emerging from a period where literacy was limited and stories spread primarily through performance rather than mass reading. Instead of opening a book, people gathered to listen. Professional performers known as rhapsodes traveled from place to place, reciting epic poetry before live audiences. Not for 10 minutes, for hours, sometimes over several days. That raises another question. How do you remember a poem that long? The answer may already be hiding inside the poem itself. If you've ever tried reading the Odyssey, you've probably noticed something strange. The same descriptions keep appearing. And again. Modern readers sometimes find this repetitive, even awkward. Today, most editors would probably remove repeated descriptions like these. So, did Homer simply have a habit of repeating himself? For centuries, many readers treated those phrases as little more than poetic decoration. Then, in the 20th century, a young scholar named Milman Parry asked a different question. What if repetition wasn't the problem? What if repetition was the solution? Parry traveled through what is now Bosnia and neighboring regions, recording singers who performed enormous epic poems without reading from a manuscript. As he listened, he noticed something remarkable. The singers reused the same descriptive phrases over and over, not because they had memorized every word, and not because they lacked creativity. Those repeated phrases fit the rhythm of the poetry. They could be recalled instantly, combined in different ways, expanded, shortened. They acted almost like reusable building blocks. Suddenly, Homer's repeated descriptions looked completely different. Instead of signs of poor writing, they looked like memory technology, a way to help performers construct thousands of lines of poetry while reciting them aloud, long before notebooks, long before printing presses. long before cloud storage. The poem had been optimized for the human brain. That explains something important. It helps explain how the Odyssey survived long enough to be written down, but it doesn't solve the mystery. Because surviving the first few centuries is one thing, surviving the next 2,500 years is something else entirely. After all, countless oral traditions disappeared. Countless epics were forgotten. So, why did generation after generation continue copying, teaching, and preserving this one? Who decided the Odyssey was worth saving? The answer takes us somewhere unexpected: a classroom. Because the people who ensured Homer's survival weren't necessarily his biggest fans. One of his most famous critics was also one of history's greatest philosophers, Plato. And that creates an even bigger mystery. If Plato thought Homer was dangerous, why did Greek civilization continue building its education around him? Imagine you're responsible for educating an entire civilization. You have to decide what every child should read. What would you choose? Mathematics, history, law, religion? The ancient Greeks had an answer: Homer. Not just the Odyssey, not just the Iliad. Homer. For centuries, these poems formed the foundation of Greek education. Children copied Homer to learn handwriting. They memorized Homer to practice reading. Teachers quoted Homer to teach language. Public speakers borrowed Homer to sharpen rhetoric. If you wanted to become an educated Greek, you started with Homer, which sounds like the perfect explanation. Maybe the Odyssey survived because every generation simply passed it to the next. Case closed. Except there's a problem. Not everyone thought Homer belonged in the classroom. In fact, one of the greatest philosophers in history thought Homer was dangerous. Plato admired poetry, but he worried about what it taught. In the Republic, he argued that many stories about the gods and many passages from Homer presented terrible role models. The gods lied, they cheated, they fought. Heroes gave in to grief. Revenge often looked honorable. According to Plato, children shouldn't grow up believing these were examples worth copying. So he proposed something extraordinary. An ideal society should censor or exclude much of Homeric poetry from education. Think about that for a second. One of the most influential philosophers in Western history wanted to remove the most influential poet from the classroom. If Plato had succeeded, this documentary might not exist.
So, did he?
Not even close. If anything, Homer became even more important. Why? Because Plato had accidentally revealed something. You don't spend pages arguing against a book unless everyone is already reading it. Plato wasn't introducing Homer to his audience. He assumed they already knew him. His criticism only makes sense if Homer was already deeply embedded in Greek culture. And Plato wasn't the only one. Other ancient writers quoted Homer as if their readers would instantly recognize the reference. They treated Homer as common knowledge. It's a bit like quoting Shakespeare today. You don't stop to explain who Shakespeare is. You assume your audience already knows. That's the kind of cultural position Homer occupied in the ancient Greek world. Not just a famous author, a shared language, a shared reference point, a shared education. Every student needed a text, every teacher needed a manuscript, every city wanted scholars. That meant more copies, more readers, more teachers, more copies again. The poem wasn't surviving by accident anymore. It had become infrastructure. The educational system itself was keeping Homer alive, and once a book reaches that point, it becomes incredibly difficult to erase. Even criticism can make it stronger. Plato criticized Homer, but to criticize Homer, students first had to read Homer. Ironically, one of Homer's greatest opponents may have helped ensure that future generations kept studying him. At this point, the mystery seems solved. The Greeks preserved Homer because they built their schools around him. Simple. Except history had another surprise waiting. Because civilizations don't last forever. Schools disappear, governments collapse, empires fall. And eventually, Greece did too. Normally, that's where the story ends. When one civilization conquers another, its literature often disappears with it. The languages change, the schools change, the books change, history moves on. So when Rome conquered Greece, the Odyssey should have become another forgotten relic. Instead, something completely unexpected happened. The conquerors became students, and that decision would change the future of Western literature forever.
Why? And how did that decision change the future of Western literature?
At first, the answer seems simple. Maybe the Romans just admired Greek culture, but admiration alone isn't enough. History is filled with civilizations that admired those who came before them. Very few preserved their literature for centuries. So, what made Rome different? One clue comes from the Roman poet Horace, who famously wrote, "Captive Greece took captive her fierce conqueror." It's a remarkable statement. Rome conquered Greece with its armies, but when it came to education, philosophy, and literature, many Romans believed the Greeks had already reached a level they should aspire to. That's why Roman elites learned Greek. It's why wealthy families hired Greek tutors. And it's why generations of Roman students continued reading Homer long after Greece had lost its independence. But was Homer simply part of the curriculum, or had he become something greater? One man gives us the answer: Virgil. When Emperor Augustus wanted an epic worthy of the Roman Empire, Virgil had an extraordinary opportunity. He could have left Homer behind. He could have created an entirely new literary tradition. Instead, he chose to build upon Homer. The first half of the Aeneid follows a wandering hero searching for a new homeland, echoing the Odyssey. The second half recalls the warfare of the Iliad. This wasn't imitation, it was recognition. Virgil wasn't trying to replace Homer. He was acknowledging that every great epic would inevitably be compared against him. By this point, Homer no longer belonged only to Greece. He had become part of Rome's own cultural identity. That explains how the Odyssey survived the fall of Greece. But Rome wasn't immortal either. Centuries later, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Political institutions disappeared. Cities declined. Libraries were destroyed. Thousands of ancient works were lost forever. Once again, the Odyssey stood at the edge of extinction. Yet once again, it survived. Not because an emperor ordered it, not because an army protected it, but because countless anonymous scribes continued copying it by hand. Each manuscript represented months of careful work. Each new copy was another decision that Homer's poem deserved to endure. Then came another turning point. The fall of Constantinople scattered Greek scholars across Europe, bringing precious manuscripts with them. At almost the same moment, the printing press transformed how knowledge spread. For the first time, the Odyssey no longer depended on a handful of handwritten copies. It could reach thousands of readers. Looking back, it's tempting to think Homer's survival was inevitable. It wasn't. Every major turning point in history presented another opportunity for the Odyssey to disappear. The fall of Greece, the rise of Rome, the collapse of Rome, the fall of Constantinople. Each could have broken the chain. Instead, someone kept preserving it. Then someone else, and someone after that. By the end of this journey, the answer looks very different from where we started. The Odyssey didn't survive because of one civilization, or one empire, or one great ruler. It survived because, for nearly 3,000 years, completely different people, living in completely different worlds, kept reaching the same conclusion. This story was worth keeping. When we started this investigation, The question seemed simple. Why the Odyssey? Christopher Nolan could have adapted almost any story ever written. So why choose a poem that's nearly 3,000 years old? At first, the answer seemed obvious. Maybe it survived because it was simply the greatest story ever told, but history doesn't support that idea. The ancient Greeks produced many epic poems. Most of them disappeared. Being great wasn't enough. Then we discovered that the Odyssey survived because it could be remembered. Its repeated phrases made it easier to perform. Its structure made it easier to pass from one generation to the next. But memory alone wasn't enough either. Oral traditions vanish all the time. Then we found another answer. Greek education turned Homer into the foundation of an entire civilization. Schools copied him, teachers quoted him, students memorized him, but even that wasn't enough because Greece eventually disappeared. And yet, the Odyssey remained. Rome adopted it, scholars preserved it, printers spread it, generation after generation. People who shared no government, no language, and often no religion kept arriving at the same conclusion. This poem deserved another copy, another reader, another generation. That's what makes the Odyssey extraordinary. Not that it survived. Many ancient books survived. What's extraordinary is that every era found a new reason to keep it alive. To the Greeks, it was education. To the Romans, it was the standard of great literature. To Renaissance scholars, it was part of humanity's classical inheritance. And to modern storytellers, it remains a blueprint for exploring identity, home, loss, resilience, and what it means to return after being changed by the journey. Perhaps that's how books really change the world. Not by transforming everything the moment they're written, but by remaining meaningful long enough to transform generation after generation. Christopher Nolan isn't preserving the Odyssey. James Joyce didn't preserve it. Virgil didn't preserve it. They each became another link in a chain that began nearly 3,000 years ago, a chain made of teachers, students, scribes, translators, writers, filmmakers, and readers. Every one of them could have let the story end. Instead, they chose to tell it again. And maybe that's the real definition of an influential book. Not one that survives because it's old, but one that grows old because every generation decides it's still worth telling.